Hello, everyone. This is the 28th live stream of the Music Hackspace, and today we are welcoming Andrew Leggo. Hello, Andrew.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
So it's a great pleasure to have you today. I mean, your career as an instrument designer started in the early 80s. You designed a lot of instruments. Then you made this iconic Roland AX1 with David Sheriff. And I can't wait to hear more about that story. But what I like in particular is that even though the culture didn't have a name at the time, what you did is very relevant to what we do here. It was hacking. It was reappropriating two instruments and bringing them into one. So I really appreciate you having you today.
Oh, it's great.
We are getting spammed on Facebook, and
Nah.
I apologize. Well, I guess it's a ransom of being successful. So I will look into that one while you are presenting, and you prepared some slides today. So I'm going to bring them up and
Okay.
And let you do all the talking.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I thought I'd just do a quick potted history. So what I am now is a creative consultant, and I help people with new product development, branding, communications, live events, marketing. And it's quite broad, but that's because I've had quite a sort of journey over the years working in different disciplines with different areas of industry. So let's just get this going. Okay. So I've worked in sort of consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of places, but I started as an industrial designer for music instruments. So I graduated way back in 1983, and I left college and I went to work as a studio freelancer, and there I met David Sheriff. And one of the first things we were working on together was the Sec Mixer range, and I got into doing the kind of mechanical drawings and then also the graphics and panel layouts and things like that, working with the electronics designer. And then about, I don't know, 6 months or so down the line, in the middle of this project, the studio owner decided he wanted to relocate. And so David and I were left with this kind of decision of what should we do? You know, should we carry on? Should we go our separate freelance ways? We actually decided to go into partnership. And so we set up a thing called Space Logic. We did that in 1984. So then our focus was on audio and sort of pro audio musical instruments. I mean, we did loads of other stuff. We even designed it must have been one of the first cardboard coffins. Now you get cardboard coffins, but you didn't in those days. And we were always looking at different interesting things to do. But the focus of the work was really on pro audio and musical instruments. And did tons and tons of 19-inch rack gear. So really quite standard industry stuff from scratch. It wasn't about hacking instruments at that time. It was about literally, how are you going to make this product? How are you going to sell it? And doing the 19-inch stuff, that's what got me into the whole kind of user interface and control panel graphics, how people work with machines. And then it was all done in Letraset. So all this would have been, hand rubbed down onto a film, and then we would get films made for screen printing. And sort of the bigger stuff we did, so we did quite a lot of analog consoles, these huge recording consoles, and did a lot of work with Trident Audio, working with Malcolm Toft, who, for those of you who don't know Malcolm's history, really interesting guy, worth looking up. He was a recording engineer. He worked with Bowie. He did stuff with the Beatles. Really interesting guy, really good audio engineer, designer. And we had a lot of fun working with him. The top picture is a thing called the Diane, which, as far as I know, was one of the first desks that used digital control of analog circuitry. Ahead of its time, should we say, because I think people just weren't quite ready to get their heads around that and how it's going. Anyway, did lots of work for them. Did the 65, the 75, the 90, the Diane and the Vector. And during this time, David and I were going to Frankfurt to the Music Messe, and I can't remember exactly how we did it. I think I wrote to Roland, and said it would be really great to meet you at Frankfurt. And whether it was out of Japanese politeness that they said yes, or whether they were genuinely interested, who knows? But we did actually meet them, and then they came to London after that. And Kakahashi-san, Mr. Kakahashi, he came and visited us in our studio, which was this sort of basement in Euston. and he commissioned us to do a percussion controller, a MIDI percussion controller, and we came up with the Pad 5 for him. So after that, we were doing sort of lots of percussion controllers, MIDI ideas. We came up with this idea for a MIDI tube, which one of the things I've always been really interested in, and David as well, was this whole idea of live performance and visual impact of instruments. And so on the left, you've got, this is David with a thing called a MIDI tube, which was this sort of 6 foot long pole, pads down the side, pads at the bottom, link it up to MIDI. Now for our hack, the reality of this was we just had inside that pole was just a bit of inch by inch wood with there were pinball machine buttons. We sourced the buttons you get on the edge of a pinball machine, and then we hardwired it using telephone cable to it was a Boss rhythm machine, DR550 or something. I think David actually soldered straight onto the circuit board contacts so that we could demo this thing. And it was quite funny because I ended up taking it to Tokyo to Japan to show Roland, and taking that through Narita Airport and trying to explain to them it's not a pipe bomb, it really is a musical instrument with very little Japanese. That was quite funny. I'm not sure you'd do it, you wouldn't get away with it now. Anyway, long story short, Roland didn't like that, or they liked it, but they didn't like it enough to take it on. So we sort of started thinking elsewhere. And eventually, I think because of one of our clients ended up working at Real World, then a version of it ended up with in the hands of Peter Gabriel. But before that, a guy called Luke Creswell, we were introduced to Luke Creswell, who is one of the guys who set up Stomp, the percussion dance troupe that tour all over the world. And he came to the studio, and we did a lot of work talking with him about percussion and how that would work. So while we were doing that, we were also doing custom keyboards for people, and we were hacking KX5s, which were the Yamaha Keytar, and then DX100s, because they had these kind of slightly smaller keys and everything, which made them suitable for making custom keytars. And this little trilogy here shows, it's quite a fun story. So on the left, that's a polystyrene mock-up. The keys are actually it's a photocopy of keys, magic marker to black in the black keys. And that was done for Howard Jones. They kind of wanted something for Howard to play on TV or to look good. And basically, from what I remember, Howard Jones probably turned around and said, "There's no way I'm playing that," because, well, he's Howard Jones, and it's not a very Howard Jonesy type thing. Anyway, so we were left with this thing, and then the people who were behind the management, who were behind Wham, were looking for the next boy band, and they had a band called Blue Mercedes. And this was at the time of MTV, and so everyone needed their pop video, and they said, "We want something to look good on the video." And we said, "Well, we did this for Howard Jones, but maybe you could use that." And so they did. And it was fine. In fact, JB, have we got that video? Can we just show that video? Oh, I'm not sure we're going to be able to see that. Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay, that's enough of that. But I mean, this was, this in the age of MTV, you've got, you didn't have, it wasn't 4K TV or anything like that. You could get away with a polystyrene model that, they could mine with. And then if we go back to this picture, so the middle picture was the fact that once they'd done their video, they started to do personal appearances where they were in front of a live audience. They weren't playing because they were miming to a backing track, because in those days, if you went on Top of the Pops, most of the time you'd be miming. So they needed an instrument that looked like a real instrument, looked like the one that was in the video, but the audience weren't going to say, "Oh, there's a bit of polystyrene." So we made the middle one. The middle one was actually MDF, weighed a ton. We put the keyboards from DX100s in it, and we put a light switch on the end that lit up, a little button on the end that lit up, just to imply that it actually did something, but it didn't. It just knocked. And then they turned around and said, "Right, we're going on tour, but we have to play. We need to be able to play. So can you make us one that actually works?" And we developed the third one, which we called the Blue 2. Blue because it was for Blue Mercedes, 2 because it was the second double keyboard that we'd made. And as far as I know, this was the world's first double keyboard. In fact, there's one in space too. Oh, here we go. So this is the non-working one on top of the top, so it looks all right onto our live audience. And then we quickly show, I don't know if you got that last clip, JB, of the one that works. Maybe not, you only see it in fleeting glances during, so the last one you only see in fleeting glances in a pop video, but basically you get the idea. So we kind of went from, I think JB made me laugh the other day because he said it was like a, minimal viable prototype, in the sense that, it just had to look good on MTV. And then we went through finally to actually having something that worked. So we were doing these custom keyboards, and Roland said, okay, can you do one for us? Can you design a shoulder keyboard? And they were all called shoulder keyboards then, because keytar was a phrase that was not quite patented or copyrighted, but someone came up with it. I can't remember now. His husband and wife had it. And it was only later on that it became this kind of generic term. So if you look back at old keytars, you'll see that they're called a shoulder keyboard or something else. So this was our design for a shoulder keyboard for Roland's. And these are the full-size styrofoam prototypes we made and sent out to Hamamatsu, to Roland's headquarters. And I think we can all be glad that they chose the bottom one and not the other two. The middle one's all right, but definitely I prefer the bottom one. And that's what became the AX1. And we were sort of paying a bit of homage to Fender with the sort of hand grip, and the combined pitch bend and modulation was a new thing that we came up with for them, because no one had quite done that the same way. So you could bend and modulate at the same time, and they're actually assignable, so you could assign them to anything through a MIDI. And it's sort of become a classic, which I like as well, because you still see it played today. I'll turn on the TV and there'll be someone prancing around with it. And on the right, I had to put a picture of Rick Wakeman in, because when I was growing up, I had a poster on my wall of Rick Wakeman with all his keyboards and his cloak, and playing the full Monty of any good prog rock would do, keyboard player would do. And years later, I found a clip of him and his son Adam playing AX1s, and I wrote to him in a slightly kind of fanboy geeky way, saying, I used to have this poster of you on my wall, and then years later you're playing something that I designed. How cool is that? And he wrote back, and he wrote a really nice email back saying that he really liked it, and why he liked it, and what he liked about it. So that's nice. As a if you design an instrument, or you're creating something like that, I think one of the nicest things you can do is talk to the people who end up using it. Similarly with the Sec Mixer, the first time I was on a bus, and I went past a music shop that I'd been to as a teenager for years and years, drooling over different bits of equipment, and there in the window was this Sec Mixer that I'd worked on, and that's really fulfilling. So I highly recommend any of you guys out there who are creating stuff. It's really great when you finally get the thing out there and people start using it and you see it. So a couple of quick things. So we went on from doing kind of lightweight shoulder keyboards to designing Roland's first digital grand. And David's background, he came from the Royal College of Art, and he'd done automotive design. So we were using automotive design techniques to kind of create this thing, because it was so big, it might as well have been a car, it was so huge. And then a kind of a step change for us was with Roland, in that at the time they had their kind of strapline was "We design the future," and they commissioned us to do exactly like that. They said, can you look ahead 5 to 10 years at what's happening, what will be happening? We look at different industries, all sorts of things, kind of join the dots and work out, where's music technology going to go in terms of expression, composition, recording, and performance. So we did that, and we created all sorts of stuff, all sorts of concepts, which laid the foundations for quite a few future products. We didn't necessarily go on to design the nitty-gritty of them, but a lot of our work was there to sort of say, this is where we think it's going. We had a trusty 1040 ST camera, Atari, which we loved. It was the only thing that you could have MIDI on, and then there's a Sec Mixer in there and a D50, I think. So this is kind of typical of what we did. So DJs were kind of scratching vinyl and they were starting to use samples, but there were no dedicated products for them. And so we came up with the concept of a scratch wheel for samples. And we used paper prototypes and foam models, and we created oval shapes and forms in all sorts of formats using this idea of a scratchable sample dial, some of which look like a lot of the Pioneer stuff that came out later. But eventually, Roland Italy produced this, which is the DJ70. So this is not my physical design or David's, but it's based on all the kind of suggestions we were making about what DJs should do. Sound on Sound very kindly said it was a great product, but ahead of its time. I'm not convinced. I don't know. I think it was a good product. It had a great idea, but I think the cost of the memory and everything else just made it ahead of its time.
What was the year, Andrew, for this?
So goodness, that would have been very late 80s. So I don't know. Someone out there might well know when the release date of it might even have came out. I think it might even have come out later because we were doing this stuff, and don't forget we were looking 5-10 years ahead. So it was quite funny. So, for example, if I move on to the next thing, so on the left is Roland's personal music assistant, and we proposed this kind of thing years before it came out. And I was actually there used to be a shop on Charing Cross Road called the Turnkey Shop, and I was in there, and this thing was on display, and it's like, oh my god, they actually made it. They finally came out with it. And that was very typical of some of the stuff we did, because we were just out there kind of pushing stuff and saying, what about this, you can make this, and they didn't always do it, and sometimes they did. So the D-beam is another one. So the D-beam came about because I liked the film Close Encounters, and for those of you who remember the film Close Encounters of the Third Time, there's a scene where the scientist demonstrates the pitches that they're going to use to communicate with the alien ship, and he kind of moves his hand in these kind of known sort of forms to do the famous da 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 da. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be great if you could do that? And so we got a guy called David Greaves or someone in Cambridge to build us this wooden frame with infrared sensors and a source, and we linked it to a MIDI control system, so you could literally put your hand in and you could do it. And we took that was another one of the weird and wacky things we took to Hamamatsu and said, look, you could do this. And they were like, oh yeah, that's really interesting, guys, but maybe not at the moment. And then quite a few years later, they did have the D-beam, which I think they bought that technology from an Israeli company. I can't remember exactly who they are, but I'm sure someone will tell us. And then, so if you like, the DJ 70, the thing with the scratchy wheel, that was about addressing sampling for DJs. And at the time, though, there was nothing really for live performance and sequencing, because with sequences, what tended to happen is you'd program them, and then you'd set them going, and then you'd perform, and they'd be going. And if suddenly there's guitars, the guitarist wants to do a solo or something, you can't, because the sequence is just saying, I'm going, I'm a robot, this is what I'm going to do. And we met a guy called Pete Kellock, and Pete Kellock had a machine called a Zyklus, the Zyklus music performance system that he did with another person called Bill Marshall. And this machine was just brilliant. If you look it up, if you find videos about it, you'll see what I mean. It was a kind of a sequencer. And we thought this was brilliant. We wanted to get that to Roland. We wanted to kind of explore what you could do with it and how where could we go with it. So we did a load of stuff, and we built this prototype which used the Zyklus as its CPU, if you like. And then there's this huge multi-core coming out the side of it, because inside it there are all sorts of stuff. We literally just hacked a whole load of stuff together. There was I think an R5 in there, and a guitar pedal, and all sorts. But what it gave us was this device that had 16 velocity sensitive pads. It had touch-sensitive slide strips. It had rotary encoders that you could assign to do stuff. And it allowed you to play loops and everything else asynchronously or synchronously. You could quantize it, you could transpose it from a keyboard, you could do all sorts. I mean, this is, if you like, if you think of it as being, Ableton before Ableton existed, that whole idea of, create a little loop, assign it to a pad, off you go, put another one in, you can play live with it, you can do what you like. And that's what we were doing. And that really is what that work basically set the path for Roland's Groovebox range and the thing they call real-time phrase sequences. So yeah, that was fun. But again, we didn't design any of the actual MC303s and onwards, but we just said, this is what it ought to do. This is how it ought to do it. This is what we're interested in because, it's cool. And now, I mean, something like the Machina Jam, it's slide strips, it's pads launching clips and everything. Most of you out there will understand exactly what we were trying to do all those years ago. That would have been about 1990, I think, when we did that. It just took everyone else quite a long time to catch up. Okay, so moving on very quickly, after Space Logic, I went freelance, and I think I'm part of a really lucky generation because I grew up and was taught traditional design skills. So I was doing mechanical drawings on tracing paper with ink pens, and I was using magic markers. But then the birth of kind of cheap home computers and then sort of design software and interactive software came along, and I went with that flow. So I transferred those skills that I had, the traditional skills, to using sort of Photoshop. And then I found about HyperCard and Director, so I could suddenly make interactive presentations of the screen displays or the GUIs of these instruments we're designing and other stuff. And that whole kind of, I think it's really important when you're, if you're being a developer or a designer, you don't have to keep up with every trend, but it really helps if you're aware of other stuff that's going on in different disciplines and either work with people who have those skills or teach yourself those skills a bit, because then apart from anything else, it means you can talk to them in their language when you're working with someone. So I do a lot of creative direction work where I might be working on a massive stage show with loads of video and everything else, and I know that when it comes down to it, I can sit and talk with the After Effects guy and say, okay, I think we should do this, and can we do that? And he'll understand what I'm asking for, and I'll understand his answers because I've kind of gone down that path a bit. Anyway, so yeah, so 90s I went freelance and I got into touch screens for museums and exhibitions and conferences and live events. I started incorporating video, and I at one point was demonstrating Avid for people and QuickTime and Premiere and all sorts. And all of that combined into me moving into the world of corporate communications and branding and live events. And that's kind of where I am now. So in 2000, I set up Emmanuel Leggo with Anuki Emmanuel. And her background is theatre and live environment. And so between us, we kind of cover quite a lot of bases. And we work with production companies on large-scale events and projects, or we work directly with individuals, startups, developers. And a lot of what we do is about how you engage an audience. And it's why I'm talking about this now. I'll explain, because what we do is we talk about, telling a story, making it memorable. How do you make brand ambassadors? How do you get people really interested? And that could be getting people interested in your product, your idea, let alone, your brand. And when I'm working with instrument designers or developers, it's nice because I'm kind of coming full circle. So I particularly like working with music developers, because I can be talking about the form and the function of the product or the way the software works, the interface, but I can also then be talking about the brand identity or how we're going to tell the brand story. And the whole thing about engaging your audience is, remember that when you're trying to engage an audience, your audience might be an investor. You could be in a room full of people who you're trying to convince to give you money so that you're a Kickstarter, so that whole kind of telling your story is important. So anyway, enough of the history. Let's talk about instrument development. And I suppose the first question I'd say, JB, is do we need it? And I say that because if you think about bands, they've been, the setup's been the same since the 50s, guitar, bass, drums, etc. And orchestral instruments, I mean, they've been around for centuries. Truthfully, yes, we do need it. I mean, that's my take. We need progress. Progress gives you new opportunities, but I suppose the question is, where do we go from here? And we talk about, as developers and designers, there's a lot of talk about control. But if I go back to my space logic roots, then I'm interested in the kind of the performance and the visual impact, and how people achieve new things. So, and sometimes when we look ahead, we can take clues from the past. So Star Wars here, they're kind of looking at woodwork. It's like a woodwind section. But if we look at this is the Eigenharp. So I don't know if how many of you are familiar with the Eigenharp, but what I like about it is, if you look at the similarities in the sense of, it's got a mouthpiece, so people can relate to the fact that you're going to use your mouth to control some element of the sound. It's got a body that you kind of move your hands up and down to, trigger stuff. So it's kind of familiar in the way it's held and the mouthpiece and everything else, but it's not. It's something new, and it's very expressive. It's got a lot of stage presence. It's very distinctive. It's recognizable, and I would argue that this is a true instrument, a true electronic instrument. It looks like an instrument, it plays like an instrument, it's expressive. It's got everything going for it. I think we have a little clip, do we, JB? Yeah. So I think what's interesting about that is, I'm sure Gert would say, could have chosen a nicer clip, Andrew, but that's a musician, technologist, programmer, all round really clever guy called Gert Bevan, and he kind of works for Moog now. He does all sorts of stuff, but he's an Eigenharp player, and what's nice about it, it's got slide strips, it's got buttons, you can play it in all sorts of different ways. Anyway, so that's a kind of example of what I think is, it's a nice instrument. But when you're designing instruments, I think you have to think about this balance between functional tool and a performance instrument. So on the left, I just put a few things down. Obviously, if you're making, whether it's for on stage or not, the functional tool elements are, the hardware, the software, how it's constructed, all these kind of things. But then there's this additional layer when you're doing something for performance, maybe, which is about, the playability, or, how you perform with it, and the level of skill you're going to need to, actually get your head around this new thing that you're making, and then the visual impact it makes and how it reacts with lighting and costume. So, loads of things that when people, start thinking about new design or hacking something together, there are different things you need to think about, whether, where it's going to be. If it's a bit of backline equipment sitting in a studio, that's one thing. But if it's going to be a guitar, then, there's a whole load of other stuff that you have to think about. So the way we progress, the way we design new instruments, it could be just simple evolution of form, something like hang drum becoming a MIDI controller, or you could think about going too far as well, because progression is a tricky thing. Getting it right, getting that evolutionary balance right is difficult. You've got to weigh up between incremental steps that people understand and they can get their head around quite easily, or going right out there to something, totally different. I mean, there's no denying the one on the right has visual impact, but whether it's good for an instrument, who knows? And then the other thing I think is important is prototyping, because I think now there's so much progress. It's so easy to prototype now. It's much easier from an electronics point of view. Things like the Bella board allow you to, set things up and try things really easily. There are low-cost 3D printing outfits. You can get things done. You can do rapid prototyping. So, the opportunities are endless with what we could do. And so, again, as developers, what I'd say is, if you're building stuff, just build it fast and fail fast, in the sense that, and move on, in the sense that, progress with your prototyping. The idea of a prototype is it's testing something. And most of the time, you can be testing lots of things, but you can just test one thing. So you might have a visual prototype to say, is this the right look for the product? You might have a functional prototype to say, does this function work? Or you might even be testing just the way the magnetic clip works on a case or something. That prototype will tell you an answer to something. And because it's so much quicker and easier to prototype and test things these days, then fast iterations, that's the key. Don't get locked into something because, it's a baby and you've been trying and this is the way it should really work. Hack it together somehow, test it out on people, see if it works. And if it doesn't work out what's not working and then move on and change it and just keep going until you get the right thing. But the flip side to that is also because things like the Bella board and 3D printing make anything is possible. We've got no clues. As electronic product designers, music designers, where are those clues going to come in terms of shape, form, and what it does? And yeah, we can go back to the past and look at it, but there's a design school, a famous design school in Germany called the Bauhaus School. It was a long time ago in the 30s, but one of their theories was about form following function, in the sense that, if you look at the form, it will tell you what shape the thing has to be. But as is all electronic, so we could have any shape, do anything. So there are fewer physical and technical things to guide us. And Roger Lynn, who does the fantastic instrument, he has this great story about, he talks about the violin, and when you're trying to convince people about new instruments, can you imagine trying to convince people to play the violin? It's a wooden box, you have to stick it under your chin, you stretch catgut over it, and and you scrape a bit of horsehair, it's crazy. But people did it and they've done it for centuries. And if you like, we face the same challenges now because we say it's a box with lights on or it's a box with switches on, and you've got to somehow convince people how it's going to work. And the thing about, say, Roger's instrument is it is a new instrument. You have to invest time to learn and play it. So there are some kind of halfway houses. This is the Rolly, which I think most people will be aware of in this group. It's, from an expression point of view, it's fantastic, really interesting. But one of the questions that often comes up with people who play it for the first time is the fact that it has a very definite feel. The keys are this sort of silicon feel. And the question is, you have to say, well, it is a new instrument, and to master it and play it properly, you've got to play. You've got to invest that time. And it's an example of what I call a familiar but not interface, in the sense that it's familiar because it has a piano key layout, but it's not familiar because it feels totally different. It's quite interesting because, obviously having that reference makes it easier for people to get their head around. And it's why if you're designing something or hacking something together, if you can reference something that people can instantly latch onto, that will really help. So let's just move on a bit quicker. So in the same way, this is Touch Keys by Andrew McPherson. And this is a kit of circuit boards that you apply to the surface of your keys. And it gives you MPE control. So it gives you, fantastic expressive playability. Can we just see that clip, please, JB?
Measure the position of the fingers in both axes, and we can also measure the contact area of the touch. And with the Touch Keys software, we can map any of these things to polyphonic aftertouch. Let's try it.
Okay, that's great. So what I like about the touch keys is that it keeps that familiar keyboard action, which makes the potential uptake much faster for people. But it does still feel a bit weird because the PCBs are stuck on the surface. And to sort of get over that, here I have to sort of declare an interest in quite a while ago now, but I worked with Andrew and helped him get a new demonstration prototype made where we basically incorporated the circuitry into the surface of the keys to give people a more natural feel, just to see, how people reacted to that, really. And then there are lots of other devices. Lots of people are making stuff, with around screens. Jordan Rudess, has his GeoShred. Really interesting. Lots of opportunities using tablets and screens, and even kind of some kind of hybrid. These were kind of knobs that were launched on Kickstarter quite a while ago now, but you could actually add them over your app and then control using analog control of your apps, which the sort of hybrid approach is quite interesting. Maybe you're going to build stuff into stuff that is quite familiar but not, so guitars but with pads in them. I mean, Jordan has a holder for one of his iPads that he plays and uses like a guitar. So maybe that's a way we could think about going as designers. But the tablets and knobs and sliders, they're all interesting, but how do you engage the audience? Going back to this thing about performance, we can't all have massive stage shows. And if no one can see these devices, how do we get the visual impact? Is it a question of scale? Should we be looking at, just big tablets or glass panels that show the audience what we're doing so they can see the dexterity that you use the controls, as they might have seen someone playing a violin? Video projection, live coders and VJ software, all good stuff. But if you think about a violin doesn't rely on video or anything like that. I mean, yes, if you're in a big concert, you'll have a screen, but you watch the person playing. So some people could argue, is it actually anything to do with the instrument design? Should we be worrying about that? Should we be worrying about the visual side of it? I think we should. But because there is no aesthetic kind of form follows function, then you've got to think about, well, what are you going to do? Anyway, something to think about for everyone. Going back to the performance side as well, is it about educating the audience? Do we need to educate our audience about what we're doing? I mean, Imogen Heap with the Mimu gloves, for those of you who don't know, worth checking out. Really interesting gesture control. You can map it to anything. Lots of control. Great. And I'd say really good as a composition tool because she gets lots of expression, she can add to her mood. And as a performer, it's great for her as a performer because she can really get into the performance. But for the audience, there's the question of, does it matter, or can they tell what she's doing? I mean, if we go back to but if we think back to the MTV thing where we had a bit of styrofoam and we were doing this, the audience didn't, they weren't really looking to think, oh yeah, that's not really working or anything else. They're not really doing that. They were just miming. And similarly, I could stand on a stage and mime and do this in the same way, the Close Encounters or the D-Beam or any of those, and it would open up a filter or it would do something. But I could be miming to that sound and no one would know the difference. So there's that. That's something else to think about. How does the audience know what you're doing? Is it a question of educating the audience, or is it actually about putting something into the instrument that kind of makes it easier for them to understand? I think light, going back to Jean-Michel Jarre all those years ago with a laser harp, you could see the beams being broken, and it was kind of easy to relate to that kind of plucking of strings. And I think using light generally and VR and AR, I think that's got a huge potential. I was playing with some VR music composition stuff a little while ago. It's interesting. I think it has got something in it. I think we're going to end up with a whole load of hybrids somewhere along the line. This came out a few years ago, and I thought it was nice just because it kind of does what I've talked about in the sense that in the studio, you can program it, you can use it as an instrument on your desk, but then you can detach the outer ring and then use it for performance, and it's got strong visual impact. I've no idea how successful it was as a product, but it's interesting. So summing up, I think when you're working on something, and certainly when I'm working with developers, I kind of ask them 4 questions, or get them to ask themselves these 4 questions. Why are you doing it? Are you solving a problem? Are you filling a gap in the market? Are you doing it to make yourself rich and famous? Is it just for fun? Who's your target market? Who's your audience? Who are you aiming at? And to find that out, it might be that you need to do the research to empathize with the users. I do a lot of work with design students, and talking about design thinking techniques, and that's a kind of user-centric approach to design, where get to know your users, understand who you're designing for, and what's it for. What does it do? Obvious, but sometimes I get people come to me and they say, look, I've got this, and then you say, but what does it do? And they're not quite sure, because it does so many things, or maybe it doesn't do enough and they haven't quite thought it through. And then when you know the sort of who's it for, what does it do, you can do the kind of how. You can say, how are you going to do it? How are you going to build it? And that means thinking about all of this lot. Think about the aesthetics, the ergonomics, function, construction, branding, the marketing, and timing. Don't be ahead of your time necessarily. It'd be great if you can do something that everyone latches onto and they get it, and it's a leap. But be aware that sometimes you can do that and actually people go, I don't get it, and then it doesn't sell or whatever. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on designing instruments and everything else. So we're done, JB, if you want to take away the slides and we can just talk about whatever you're interested in.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome. I went on a bit, sorry guys, but
no, please. It was a really, really interesting journey. And there's one thing that I would like to go back to in the way you approach all the different parameters that come into play when you design an instrument. One of those that stuck with me was how you have to manage the function, as you said, of the instrument. So a piano, for example, allows you to make many notes at once, and if you have a master keyboard at home that's MIDI enabled, then you can also use it for production. Used in the studio, and that's probably the composer's first friend. The go-to place, your MIDI controller to control your environment. Now the guitar, you can't play Chopin on it. You can't do that. I mean, you would struggle, but now it serves a purpose that's completely different, and it's not the relationship with your music and with your production and your studio and your environment. It's your relationship with the people. It's a relationship with a guitar player who for ages took the center of stage, and the keyboard players wanted to get maybe a bit of that. And like all of these parameters are so important. Like who would have thought that by sacrificing some of the main feature of the piano, which is the ability to play many notes, and just to constrain it to playing leads and maybe adding some pitch bends and effects, but by adding the ability to move with it, you would create a successful product. And I think this parameters, the relationship with the audience, as you say, the visibility and the relationship with the music itself, these have to be balanced.
I mean, I think what's interesting about the guitar, I mean, the guitar has been around a long time. I mean, like, way before electronics. I mean, I've got a photo somewhere of something that was, 17th century, this kind of thing. I mean, really, it's kind of weird. But the thing about the guitar is there was a logic to the progression, if you like, because something like the Moog synth, that came out, monophonic. So you couldn't play like you play a piano. So if you were gonna kind of give a keyboard player something, you say, well, okay, well, look, we can give you your synthesizer and make it so you can play it like this. And they could only play with one hand. They had no option. It was only monophonic. So there are early Moog guitars, and they're exactly that. So there was a kind of logic to it. It wasn't kind of here's a lovely Bluthner Grand or a Yamaha Grand, and we're going to just somehow kind of reduce that down to something that you can play like this. It's just no. So yeah, that I think that is interesting. That kind of there's always a reason why things happen, and it is this thing about joining the dots, and I think a lot of what I do now is that kind of joining the dots. You kind of look at what's happening in different areas of the music industry, say, or of different technologies, different industries. I mean, I talk quite a lot about a thing called reciprocal inspiration, where you get inspiration from completely different fields, fashion, architecture, wherever. And it's reciprocal because ideally by working together, you give them something back as well. But basically pulling your ideas from all over, it's so important to think about how you're going to do it. But yeah, you're right. This kind of, sometimes when you're faced with this kind of thing of, I could do anything, I've got a bellerboard, I've got a this, I've got a that, and I can put this on. You can go too far, and it's good to kind of slim it back and think, well, do you really need to be able to play all 88 keys all at once? And maybe you could just slim it down. And there's a story, I think I may have told you a long time ago, that years ago someone came to us with an old tobacco tin with a knob on it, and it had some electronics inside there, a bit of breadboard that they'd made, and it had, and they kind of said, look, this is what it does, and I'd like you guys to kind of develop it into a saleable product. And we did that, but along the road, and this was, hands up, I was only 20 something, I was learning, but somewhere along that line, the feature creep was just ridiculous. It went from this rather elegant, beautiful kind of basic thing that someone had built on their home bench to this, I mean, yeah, visually it was stunning, and I would say that because I designed it with David, but it had so much going on it. It was ridiculous. It became this kind of Frankenstein's monster of all these things. And I do feel sometimes that had we taken a step back and really thought about the users, going back to the thing about think about your users, what do they really want? What's going to be useful for them? I think we would have then pared it right back again and made a much more elegant product for them. But
this is a very common This is a very common trait in the inventors, I think, or maybe it's engineering. I don't know at which stage it happens, but this feature creep, where does it come from? There's a desire to always add some more features. How does that happen? How can you avoid it?
It doesn't. Well, I'm glad to say it doesn't happen much with me now, and certainly hasn't done for a long time, because I'm very. I mean, I keep when I'm. As I say, I do some teaching sometimes with product design students. I'm always saying to them, read the brief, do some work, read the brief again, get back to the brief, read it again, read it again, read it. Think about what are you doing, why are you doing. It's those 4 questions. Just keep going back to that. Keep asking yourself, what am I doing it for? What's it supposed to do? Who's it for? How are they going to use it? And keep testing. This thing about building fast prototypes. Just do that, because you'll very quickly learn. The feature creep. You'll very suddenly you'll learn very quickly that you've just started to make this thing too much of a monster, because people say, well, why does it have to do that? Why can't I just do this? And can't I have a phone that just makes phone calls, or whatever it is? So that the creep, unfortunately, I think for all of us who are creative, we can't help but think, oh, but we could, and you get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think it's really important that you have to kind of keep a foot on the ground and say, yeah, I could do that, but maybe we'll wait, maybe we'll have another version, maybe we'll take those features and put them into something else, or maybe we'll make that an add-on for the people who really want to deep dive into this thing. And also, you can use it as a way of keeping on your timescale, because if you can, sometimes, the feature creep goes in such a way that they think, oh yeah, well, we've got the basics now, but we're now working on this new extra super duper function. And that means actually, guys, sorry, we're going to delay it by another 6 months, the launch. And it's like, no, just, bring it back.
Right. So we had a comment about a product that I'm very familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you know it, the the sound plane. It's a beautiful instrument. It's a wood board with
Yeah.
sensors, and it plays a little bit like a keyboard, or like an instrument, I suppose,
Right.
or a continuum, Haken continuum.
Yes. Okay.
So it's kind of in this vein of designs, and it's built by Randy Jones in Seattle, and
All right.
and with Randy we did actually the very first live stream of the Music Hackspace back in 2013 or something, and when he presented his product to a group of us in London. And someone mentioned it, and I thought it was a good thing to honor, like, because Randy is on his own and he's built all the software.
I'd love it. Have you got a picture? Have we got one we can show, or we got?
At the next question, I'll take the time to look it up. But the sound plane by Madrona Labs.
Okay, I'd love to look at that.
It's an instrument that feels good as well, because it's sturdy and it's in wood.
See, I'm very interested in that. I have a little back burner project of my own that I'm really interested in, that whole kind of craftsmanship. It's why I like the Eigenharp in a way, because there's a lot of craftsmanship in that, how it's built, the materials they've chosen to use with. And so, this sounds really interesting. The sound plane, there's something really rather nice about wood, and also from a sustainability point of view, as industrial designers, I mean, for the last few decades, I mean, we've been guilty of, producing a lot of plastic, So, I'm really interested in sort of going back to that craft. Ooh. Oh, yes, I have seen this.
You've seen it, yeah.
Yeah. Really interesting. Really, really interesting. Yeah. I love that whole, there's, in fact, interestingly, on a similar vein, there's an artist in the States called Nomi, and she's got a double keytar. Ironically, she's designed this double keytar, but she's working with a luthier. So they're looking at, I think they've got a long way to go with it, but it's really interesting what they're doing, because I really like that idea of, yes, we can all make plastic buttons and switches and sliders, but wouldn't it be nice to have the craft that at some point someone valued it as much as they might do a Stradivarius or something like that? They say, this was, from 2035, and it was whatever. Wouldn't that be lovely? Let's design to do that.
Well, we have a question from Marek Bereza, who was on the live stream recently, and is also an app inventor and a designer. And he has a question, which is kind of a loaded question, because he builds live looping himself. So do you have any thoughts about live looping as a sort of instrument performance tool?
Yes, I love it. I think it's a really good idea. It's what that whole kind of Roland thing was about. It's that, basically allow people to create that. But if you're talking about live looping, as in the sense of something like Tim Exile would do, or sort of some of those artists, I think that's really interesting. Sort of building out stuff. I think Tim's Endless software is really interesting as well. And I think there's a lot of mileage in that. I think, again, it's this educating the audience thing, and I think. The love it or loathe it, but the Ed Sheeran performance that he did at Glastonbury years ago of Shape of You with a loop pedal, there are loads of people who never really understood what that was about, and some of them thought he was just miming to a backing track. But that whole performance and looping and being able to do that well, I think there's a lot of mileage for looping instruments.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Jacob Collier as well is fantastic at live looping. But like I suppose also the question is not only in the design or in the use of live looping as a feature, but also how and what does it mean to physicality, and is there the design has to be on the software side and on the hardware side, the points of control when you do that. And we have pedals that exist, and we have great apps like Endless or the Koala sampler. And many others, and Machina. But did you think the ultimate live looping instrument has been invented yet?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there are some really interesting pedals around, as you say, and things like that. There was a really nice art installation a few years ago which used sort of spheres about this big, and they had a sort of a table, massive table. I mean, I don't know, 3 meters long, 4 or 5 meters long. I don't know, can't remember. But where you put the ball down in the track, it was like triggering a sound on a track. So you could physically put this thing down. You know, visitors to the experience could literally just put it down, and it was like step sequencing and triggering a step sequencer. And going back to that idea of, you know, when I said about tablets, is it a question of scale? You know, do we have large? I think there's a lot of mileage there for, you know, maybe people could explore for live looping, a way that the audience visually understand what's going on. It's this thing about, you know, whether it's gesture control or anything else, but with looping, you know, if you could physically, you know, if you, I don't know, glass wall kind of thing, and you kind of put something that there, and people can instantly, you know, see what you're doing with it, and maybe you can turn it and twist it to change the filtering on that loop, and then you leave that one there, and then you pick up another one and put it over there and start putting another loop in. You know, something visual that pulls the audience in and they can really see it, and then they can see it when you move it as well. You know, so you take that one that's been sitting there just doing a really steady kind of drone, and you kind of bring it down here, or you put it over there, and it changes. People will get it and they'll see. So I think, yeah, I think there is a lot of exploration to be done with live looping and physical stuff.
Great. Well, I just want to invite anybody to comment online if they have questions. But I have another big question, kind of big, which relates to, you know, to the momentum or lack of in orchestral instruments, and which is, you know, 95% of what is taught around the world and perpetuated is this tradition of learning an instrument the hard way. And many inventors, many of them with us today, are, you know, are interested in changing that, in lowering the barriers to learning, to having fun, you know, want to remove the all the pain of this. And what we see on the other hand is that electronic instruments, you know, have a shelf life. Most often than not, you don't build a repertoire. You don't have like composition built specifically for a new instrument. I mean, to some exceptions. I mean, the theremin and a few others have had their fair share of composition. But do you think this is going to change at some point? There will be a tipping point where, you know, what's characteristic of the symphonic instruments will appear obsolete?
Wow, that is a big question. I think what's interesting is that I think there are always going to be the two sort of schools, if you like, pardon the pun, but there's always going to be the people who feel that it's not a serious instrument, you're not a serious musician unless you've invested the 10,000 hours and you've mastered your skill and everything else. And then there are other people who want to pick something up and just have instant gratification and play. And I mean, the first job I ever had was working in a music shop, and they sold pianos and guitars and everything. But the thing they used as an attractor to get people into the shop was they had these old kind of console organs, you know, the 2 keyboard things. But the thing they used to grab people in was the fact that it was made by Kimball, and it had a 1-finger chord system. You know, so basically you could, you know, play anything this side, and you know, and it would play the chords, and that actually really appealed to a lot of people. You know, just that idea that you don't have to invest hours and hours to get it right. But I think with electronic stuff, I think it's a generational thing as well, because, you know, my kids, they just pick up any bit of electronics, and I know it's a cliche, but they just go with it. They're not wait. I was like this, just because I was a bit weird at the time, but you know, I wasn't afraid of breaking anything. I just kind of think, how does it work? How do you take it apart? What happens if I press this? You know, and they do that with the software. So I think the younger generation, as it were, are going to be much quicker to pick things up, not worry so much about that kind of learning pain that we all, you know, that you feel you ought to go through. I mean, just look at the number of libraries of loops that you can get, and you know, they're already done for you. You know, you need a rhythm guitarist, oh yeah, fine, you know, just bung that in, and they're not worried about it, you know, in terms of composing and working with it. So I think what might happen, well, no, I don't think so. I was about to say, maybe what will happen is that we'd start to lose the more difficult instruments, you know, in the same way there are some older, quite esoteric instruments that not many people know how to play anymore. But I don't think that will happen. I think probably that level of, you know, violins and oboes and even saxophones and, you know, reed instruments and brass, and I think people will always play those because they like the sound and there's enough of it and enough of a back catalogue, if you like, for people to want to reproduce that. But it's a really interesting question. I think,
I mean,
yeah. Go on.
if you consider that, you know, like an instrument that's hard, like the oboe,
Yeah.
for example, you know, it's hard to play, but also it's very hard to play on its own. Like you need to play with others.
Yes.
For it to actually make sense. I mean, no offense to oboe players. I'm sure some would disagree with what I just said, but you know, how can you perpetuate that tradition when you actually need an ensemble to play, when the contrast with apps and phones and electronics is, or the competition.
But maybe that's the way it goes. You know, maybe that's, you know, that is the way to look at it. You know, a kind of a hybrid combination. You know, if you want to play the tuba, you know, do you end up wearing a VR headset and the rest of the orchestra is around you? And the orchestra is following what you're playing, or you're reading a virtual score, or and it, you know, it could be some kind of weird combination, or maybe you have something an app that recognizes what you're doing, and then either a bit of AR or it kind of responds to you. So I think that's interesting. You know, that whole kind of how can we combine these things? So I've got a friend who similar age to me, well, actually no, younger than me, otherwise they get upset. Younger than me, but they've started as an adult to learn to play the piano, and they're saying, you know, this is hard. It's like, well, yeah, it is hard because the piano doesn't really do much for you unless you learn how to do it properly. So getting them to work with apps and to work with, you know, digital keyboards and things that can just give them that bit, so that, you know, if you set someone down at a piano, it's really quite hard to get that gratification quickly enough for them to stick with it. But if you can give them something, you know, a digital keyboard will allow them to do that. Although interestingly, there was a really nice interview with Paul McCartney where he was talking about teaching music to kids, and he was saying, you know, just teach them 3 chords, because, you know, if you teach them 3 basic chords, they can sing along and play along to pretty much, you know, a lot of stuff. I mean, I think sorry, we kind of digressed a bit, but I think in answer to that kind of, how do you know, the classical instruments and things like that, I think there are all sorts of things going on, but I think for me it probably is the hybrid route that would allow to get people in more effectively, because I think there'll be people who like the sound of the instrument, they like the physical form. I mean, you know, in lockdown I've been teaching myself to play the saxophone, which is hysterical for me and probably very annoying for my neighbors, but you know, because I love the shape and I love the sound, and you know, it's a great thing to do. But I can imagine if there was a way that you could bring it more to life by having some kind of virtual accompaniment or something like that, that could be interesting.
Yeah, that's like a very good business idea for an app. We have a question from Alex Milanov. Do you know an instrument that didn't get traction when it was released, but should merit a second look?
Goodness. So, I mean, a lot of people will laugh about this, but there was an instrument called the Synthax, which was this very bizarre looking thing.
Yes.
And I mean, it is very bizarre.
Yeah.
But if you look at what it's doing and how it's doing it, it was interesting.
Would you say it was an example of feature creep, the Synthax?
No, I think it was just too weird for its own time. I think it was, you know, it just was weird and expensive. I think there's another thing. There's a musician called Dave Vorhaus, and he has a thing called a kaleidophone, which is magnetic tapes, and it's played a bit like a Chapman stick. I have no idea, you know, how profitable, it's not mainstream, put it that way. But interesting, again, really interesting is what it's trying to do. What else that didn't
The
really?
syntax, just to go back on the syntax, just so,
Yeah.
it's hard for me as a Frenchman to pronounce. But it's,
My son has the same thing. Yeah.
it's a synth axe
Yes.
in one word, and I think it just missed the MIDI boat as well. So it was not
Yes,
able
that's right. It
to
was.
do MIDI.
Did they not do a MIDI retrofit for it or something? I don't know. Maybe not.
Possibly.
I don't know. But
there's
yeah.
some very interesting stories because he did make at the time it was like on mainstream TV.
Yeah.
And there are some videos of the syntax of the presentation that are very interesting. And today it feels
Well, now you look at it and you just think, oh my god, it's weird. Yeah. So there are quite a few. I mean, we proposed quite a few things to Roland that just never got done, and you just think, yeah, that would have been nice. I'm not going to say them now because you never know these things kind of come along. But
and you mentioned the Chapman stick as well. I mean, probably not everyone know about the Chapman stick, which was invented, if I'm not mistaken, by Max Matthews.
I don't know, actually. I don't know who that was. I'm sure someone on the chat will tell us who did it.
Well, Maritrika has another question. Do you have any thoughts on designing the customization aspects, presets, mapping, etc., of an instrument interface, which is something quite specific to electronic instruments?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting when you're looking at the presets that come. So I'm a complete preset lover. I mean, I do go in and tweak all my sounds when I'm playing, but quite often I'll just sit there and play all the presets because if they've been done properly, then it's great. I mean, if you think about the Rolly stuff and some of the sounds they were developing for MPE, so yes, it's sorry, let me just check what the so I think the customization of, yes, I think it is important to be able to customize them, basically, because instant gratification, going back to the other thing, you go into a music store or whatever, you hit through the presets and you think, oh, that sounds great, that sounds great, that sounds great. But then when you're using it in anger as an artist, you want that unique sound. So you want to be able to tweak it, and I'm sure it can be very frustrating if you cannot get into it. I think the trick is to make it tiered and leveled and think about your users so that the people who want to do it, yes, they can get into it and do it without it necessarily getting into kind of hard coding or something like that. But similarly, the person who just wants to go into the shop and go, what's that do? What's that sound like? They can get something really great out of it that's specific to that instrument. Because anyone can make a pad string sound, but the trick is to make that pad string sound work in a way with your particular instrument, so that it's, because it used to be much easier for people to be to stand out as designers and as instruments. It was easier for things to stand out because if you wanted that sound, you had to get that keyboard. So hence Rick Wakeman would have stacks of keyboards, and people still do. And yes, you have weighted keyboards and non-weighted keyboards for different sounds and things. But it's the same with the presets. I think people need to be able to delve in, but don't make it so kind of scientific and difficult for them to dive in that it puts the kind of your beginners off. Because what you want is the people to buy into it and then spend the time getting to know it. It's like any bit of software. I mean, I've used Photoshop since version 1, literally, for decades, and there are still layers and layers in there that probably, if I delved into it, it's like, oh, didn't know I did that. Oh, I didn't know I could do that, which is great. So there is that huge depth behind it, but at the same time, you can teach someone to use Photoshop within 5 minutes, the basics, and then after that, it's what they do with it. So yeah, I think it's really important. I think presets and adapting the presets to really suit the instrument you're designing, and then allowing people to then customize them at their own level. I think that's great.
Well, in the meantime, we had a correction from Tim. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
the Chapman stick was devised by Emma Chapman. in the early 70s. Thank you so much. I can't remember what the name of Max Matthews' similar stick is called, but that really was around the same time. Alex is also asking, what was the name of the magnetic tape instrument you mentioned?
Oh, it's called the Kaleidophone,
Kaleidophone.
and it was by a musician called Dave Vorhaus. And the reason I came across that was when I first left college, I went to work in the studio. There were these kind of zinc die casting or aluminium castings lying around on the. I mean, we had bits of Midas mixer and all sorts of stuff lying around, old projects. But there was this casting, and when I asked what it was, it said, "Oh, that's from a Kaleidophone." And it's like, "Oh, okay." So, but I think he's still around, and I think he's still doing it. I mean, he's still wielding the Kaleidophone around, and it's fascinating what it does. Anyway, yeah, check it out.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions, but if there's a final word, the radio baton. Thank you so much, Tim. The radio baton is what Max Matthews had invented. It's sort of reinvention, I suppose, of the Chapman stick with sensors and things. So yeah, any last words of encouragement for all the designers?
Yeah, don't give up. Keep doing it. Just have fun with it. Or just go with it as well. Just don't be afraid to just ring people up and talk to them about it. And companies, it's much more difficult these days, but there are still ways to get your stuff in front of bigger companies. If you think it's a more mainstream thing, don't be afraid to just write to someone, ring them up, and say, I've got this idea, I'd love to come and show you. Because everyone in the music industry wants people to make music. And everyone in the music industry who make products that make music want to find the next new product. So, you are in demand as designers and developers. You are in demand making new instruments. So yeah, go for it.
Great. Well, actually, we have one last question from Alex. What do you think nowadays would be a good approach to bring a new instrument to market, pitch it to a big company like Roland yourself? Well, it looks like you've answered the question before, but maybe you have a compliment.
Yeah, I think it will really depend, Alex, on what the type of instrument is and what you're trying to do, and also what you want out of it. Because obviously, if you have the funds to back it yourself, or you want to crowdfund it and then launch it, then that's certainly a way to go. And it's what I'd say about the crowdfunding route, though, is it's a really competitive market. I mean, if you just put a search in for new instruments or something on Kickstarter or one of those, you just get bombarded with people with ideas. So if you can, going back to those 4 questions about what you're doing and who you're doing it for and everything else, if you can identify a company, you can tailor what you're doing a little bit. So we do a lot of pitch work for large production companies, and quite often we'll tailor the pitch specifically for who they're pitching to, even if some of the material is stuff that you could consider, you're talking about a particular aspect that everyone knows about, but you will try and tailor it, and you'll think about who you're approaching how. So, I mean, if you've got something, interesting enough, I was doing something earlier, and I was talking to someone about the fact that the idea they had was much more of a Yamaha product than it was a Korg product. So yes, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, and bootstrapping, you're doing it yourself, great, and there's definitely a market for that. But I think also, don't be afraid to go and see the companies, but make sure you target the right company. Think about what do they sell already, who are their target customers, and does your thing fit with them? Because then if they can see how it would fit in, or you can show them how it would fit in, then you're kind of halfway there already.
And I would add, just on a personal note, Alex, if you have a product idea that you want to share within a group, you're always welcome to contact us at the Music Hackspace. And of course, there's a confidentiality aspect that you might want to sort out in some ways. But there's like-minded people that can give you some early feedback. And I think the community aspect and testing the who is it for, I think is very important. And we want to be offering that to everyone who's in the community to be.
That sounds great.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for taking the time for sharing
Pleasure.
your story. It was fascinating, and yeah, and I hope to see you again, either on in the chat or again to present your next instrument, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a couple that I don't know. I'm not quite sure where they're going to go, and who, what vehicle. Going back to the last question, actually, is it something that you kind of think, what, we're just going to do this, going to crowdfund it, or we'll try and put it in front of someone. So we'll see. Watch this space.
All right, I will.
Okay.
Thank
Nice
you.
to talk to you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye bye. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.